The spring thaw revealed the full horror of what the winter had done to the Iceland settlement. 37 bodies, frozen solid in 9 collapsed longhouses, their faces still contorted in the final agony of freezing. Jarl Thorstein's great hall had fallen first. 80 feet of prestigious timber construction crushed under 12 feet of snow, killing the chieftain, his family, and 14 of his household. The other longhouses had followed like dominoes over the following weeks, as the worst storm in 100 years buried everything under a white shroud of death. The rescue party from the neighboring fjord found them in late April 1118, when the mountain passes finally cleared. They moved through the settlement methodically, digging into mounds of snow that had once been proud Norse halls, pulling frozen corpses from the wreckage, counting the dead. Then they reached the edge of the settlement, where a small circular stone structure rose barely 5 feet above the snow line. Smoke curled from a hole in its turf-covered roof. The rescue party leader stopped, confused. This wasn't on any map of the settlement. This looked nothing like Norse construction. A wooden door opened, small, requiring a man to duck, and a bearded figure emerged, holding a steaming cup. He looked well-fed, well-rested, wearing only a wool tunic despite the lingering cold. "Took you long enough," said Jarl Thorstein. "I've been waiting since February." The rescue party stared. Behind them lay 37 frozen corpses. Before them stood a man who looked like he'd spent winter in a comfortable hall, not in a pile of stacked stones that looked like something a thrall would build. "How are you alive?" someone finally asked. Jarl gestured at his structure, the thick stone walls, the turf-covered dome roof, the small entrance facing away from the prevailing wind. "This kept me alive. While everyone else froze in their great halls, I stayed warm in my primitive shelter. 70 degrees inside, even when it was 40 below outside." "That's impossible. Stone is cold. Everyone knows stone is cold. Stone is cold when you touch it. Stone is warm when you heat it properly. Those long houses," Jarl nodded toward the collapsed structures. "They fought against winter and lost. My shelter used winter, used the stone to store heat, used the earth to insulate, used everything Jarl Thorstein said was beneath a free Norseman." He took a sip from his cup, calm as if discussing the weather. 37 people died believing their longhouses would protect them. I survived because I built what worked instead of what looked impressive. Now, do you want to stand there asking questions, or do you want to come inside where it's warm? Jarl Thorstein had arrived in Iceland in the year 1105, part of a wave of settlers from Norway seeking land and independence. He was 26 years old, the youngest son of a minor landowner with no inheritance to claim and no prospects at home. Iceland offered what Norway couldn't, land for anyone willing to work it. But Kjartan was different from the other settlers in ways that would eventually save his life and doom his reputation. Before emigrating, he'd spent 3 years in the Orkney Islands, working as a laborer on farms that used construction techniques dating back to the Picts, the ancient people who'd built stone structures across Scotland for thousands of years before the Norse arrived. The Picts had understood something about stone that the Norse never fully grasped. Stone wasn't just building material, stone was thermal mass. Stone absorbed heat and released it slowly. Stone, properly arranged, could store a day's worth of fire warmth and release it through the night. The Picts had built low, circular stone houses with thick walls and corbelled roofs that stayed warm with minimal fuel, that survived storms that destroyed timber buildings, that lasted for centuries while wood rotted away. Kjartan had lived in such structures during his Orkney years. He'd experienced their warmth firsthand, had helped repair and maintain them, had learned the principles that made them work. When he arrived in Iceland, he knew exactly what kind of shelter he wanted to build. The problem was that building like a Pict was not how a free Norseman built. Norse culture placed enormous importance on the longhouse. A man's hall reflected his status, his ambition, his worthiness as a member of the community. Longhouses were long, narrow, timber-framed structures with central hearths, some stretching over 100 feet for the wealthiest jarls. They housed families, servants, and livestock under one roof. They were expensive, labor-intensive, and required enormous amounts of fuel to heat. They were also prestigious. A proper longhouse announced to the world that its owner was a man of means, a man who followed the old ways, a man worthy of respect. Jarl didn't have the resources for a proper longhouse. More importantly, he didn't want one. He'd seen how much fuel longhouses consumed, how cold they remained despite constant fires, how vulnerable they were to the fierce Icelandic storms. He'd seen better in Orkney, small stone houses that worked with the climate instead of fighting against it. So he built differently, and the settlement never let him forget it. Jarl claimed a plot of land at the edge of the settlement, near the mountains where good building stone was plentiful. While other settlers began constructing timber-framed longhouses, Jarl began gathering stones. He selected his stones carefully, choosing flat pieces of basalt that could be stacked without mortar. Basalt was ideal, dense, strong, and excellent at absorbing and retaining heat. He spent weeks hauling stones from nearby outcrops, creating a stockpile that his neighbors found baffling. "Building a wall?" Jarl Thorstein asked when he rode out to inspect the new settlers' progress. "Building a house from stone? Just stone? Stone and turf, the way they build in Orkney," Thorstein frowned. "We're not in Orkney, we're Norse. We build longhouses. With respect, Jarl, I have no timber for a longhouse, no thralls to help build one, no wealth to trade for materials. I build with what I have. Then you'll freeze in a pile of rocks. Stone doesn't hold warmth." "Stone holds warmth very well, Jarl, if you build correctly. The houses in Orkney—" "I don't care about Orkney. You're in Iceland now. And if you want to be part of this settlement, you'll build like a Norseman, not like a savage Pict." Jarl held Thorstein's gaze. "I'll build what keeps me alive. If that offends you, I'll accept the consequences." Thorstein rode away angry. The conversation spread through the settlement. The new man was building a Pictish hut instead of a proper hall. He was rejecting Norse traditions, embracing primitive foreign ways, showing disrespect to the entire community. They called it Kjartan's cairn, a burial mound for a man who might as well be dead to proper society. But Kjartan continued building. His technique was specific, refined through the knowledge he'd gained in Orkney. The foundation. He excavated a circular pit about 3 feet deep and 12 feet in diameter, reaching below the frost line where ground temperature remained stable. This pit would form the floor of his shelter, placing the living space partially underground. The walls. Around the perimeter of the pit, Kjartan stacked flat basalt stones in courses, each stone overlapping the joints below like brickwork. He used no mortar. The careful selection and placement of stones created a self-supporting structure. The walls were nearly 3 feet thick at the base, tapering slightly as they rose. The key innovation was the double wall construction. Jarl built an outer wall and an inner wall with a gap of about 6 inches between them. This gap he filled with dried turf and earth, creating an insulation layer that dramatically reduced heat transfer. The corbelled roof. Instead of a timber roof that required scarce wood and could collapse under snow load, Jarl built a corbelled stone dome. Each course of stones projected slightly inward from the course below, creating a gradually narrowing dome that eventually closed at the top. The technique was ancient. Pictish and Neolithic builders had used it for thousands of years, but it was unknown in Norse construction. The corbelled dome was inherently stable. Each stone was held in place by the weight of the stones above it, creating a self-locking structure that couldn't collapse. Snow load actually strengthened the dome by pressing the stones more firmly together. The turf layer. Over the stone dome, Jarl laid thick turf, sod cut from the meadow, grass side out. This living layer would grow and bind together, creating a waterproof, insulating covering that blended into the landscape. When complete, the structure would look like a grass-covered, Mound, the entrance. Jarl built a short entrance tunnel rather than a simple door in the wall. The tunnel was about 4 feet long, requiring visitors to stoop and turn as they entered. This design prevented wind from blowing directly into the living space and created a cold trap where dense cold air would settle rather than flowing into the main chamber. The hearth. In the center of the floor, Jarl built a circular stone hearth about 3 feet in diameter. The stones were selected for their heat retention properties and arranged to maximize surface area. Above the hearth, a small smoke hole in the roof allowed ventilation, while a stone slab nearby could partially cover it to control airflow. The interior. Around the walls, Jarl built low stone benches covered with turf and furs for sleeping and sitting. These benches served double duty. They kept occupants off the cold floor, and they positioned sleepers in the warmest air layer near the ceiling. The construction took Jarl 4 months of steady work. When finished, his shelter was approximately 12 feet in diameter and barely 5 feet tall at the center. A man had to stoop inside, and the space felt cramped compared to a longhouse. From outside, it looked like a stone-walled mound with a small wooden door, utterly unlike the proud halls rising elsewhere in the settlement. The mockery was immediate and constant. For 13 years, Jarl lived at the edge of the settlement, tolerated but never respected. His stone shelter was a constant source of amusement and contempt. Jarl's cairn became a joke told at every gathering. Men would describe it to newcomers as an example of how not to build: too small, too low, too primitive. They'd speculate about what kind of man would choose to live like a Pict when he could build like a Norseman. They'd suggest that Jarl must have Pictish blood, that he was barely civilized, that his rejection of proper construction reflected some deeper deficiency of character. Women wouldn't marry him. What respectable woman would live in a stone hut? Who would raise children in a space you couldn't stand upright in? Jarl's shelter announced that he was poor, strange, and destined to remain so. Jarl Thorstein refused to acknowledge Jarl's farm as a proper holding. At assemblies, Jarl was seated with the landless laborers rather than with the farmers and landowners. His voice in community decisions carried minimal weight. His opinions were dismissed without consideration. Through it all, Jarl observed things the others missed. He noticed that the longhouses required constant fires to maintain temperature, massive central hearths that consumed enormous quantities of driftwood, peat, and animal dung. He noticed that despite these fires, the longhouses remained cold away from the flames. The sleeping benches along the walls were frigid, the corners were icy, and the moment fires died down, temperature plummeted. He noticed that his own shelter stayed warm with minimal fuel. He burned a small fire for 3 or 4 hours in the evening, heating the stones of his hearth and walls. Then the fire died to coals, and the stones continued radiating heat through the night. By morning, his shelter was still warm, not hot but comfortable, 50 degrees or more, without any fire at all. His fuel consumption was perhaps 1/5 of what the longhouses required. In an Iceland where wood was scarce and peat was labor-intensive to gather, this efficiency was significant, but no one wanted to hear about efficiency from a man who lived in a pile of rocks. He noticed the structural vulnerabilities of longhouse construction. The timber frames relied on complex joints that could fail under stress. The long, narrow shape created enormous roof spans that sagged over time. The peaked roofs shed snow well in moderate storms but could be overwhelmed by extreme accumulation. Most ominously, he noticed the climate changing. Winters were becoming harsher, storms were lasting longer. The warming period that had made Iceland's settlement viable was ending, replaced by cooling that would eventually make life much harder. He tried to warn people. After particularly harsh winters, he would approach Thorstein or other leading men and suggest they consider different building methods. The longhouses are struggling. If winters continue getting worse, your cairn is the one that will fail. Stone can't withstand real cold. Stone has already withstood 13 winters. Has any longhouse needed fewer repairs? We're not having this conversation. Build a proper hall, or keep silent. So Kjartan kept silent and watched the storms grow worse year by year, knowing what was coming, unable to prevent it. The storm that would kill 37 people began on December 15, 1117. It started unremarkably. Snow flurries, moderate wind, nothing that alarmed experienced Icelanders. But it didn't stop. By December 20th, 3 feet of snow had accumulated. By December 25th, Christmas, a day that should have been spent feasting, 6 feet had fallen, and the storm was intensifying. Wind increased to hurricane force, driving snow into drifts that buried buildings to their rooflines. Temperature dropped to 30 below zero, then 40 below. The longhouses were in trouble immediately. Their central hearths couldn't generate heat fast enough to overcome the cold pouring through every gap and crack in the construction. Families huddled near the flames while the far ends of their halls dropped to freezing. Fuel consumption skyrocketed as everyone tried to maintain warmth through constant burning. Kjartan's stone shelter responded differently. He'd heated his hearthstones during the afternoon of December 15th before the storm's intensity became clear. The stones had absorbed hours of fire warmth, perhaps 500 pounds of basalt heated to over 400 degrees. When he sealed his entrance tunnel with a turf plug that evening, his shelter was 72 degrees inside. The storm raged. Snow accumulated on his turf roof, adding insulation. Wind howled around his circular walls, finding no purchase on the rounded shape. Cold pressed against the 3 feet of stone and earth that separated him from the killing weather outside. His temperature dropped slowly, 1 or 2 degrees per hour, as the stones gradually released their stored heat. By midnight, he was at 65 degrees. By dawn, 58 degrees. He lit a small fire, burned it for 2 hours using perhaps 5 pounds of peat, and restored his temperature to 70 degrees. This became his routine through the following weeks. A small fire twice daily, morning and evening, perhaps 10 pounds of fuel total. His shelter maintained temperature between 55 and 72 degrees throughout the storm, while the longhouses struggled to stay above freezing despite burning 10 times as much fuel. On January 3rd, 1118, Jarl Thorstein's longhouse collapsed. The ridgepole, ancient timber that had supported the roof for 20 years, cracked under the accumulated snow load. The sound was audible even over the storm, a sharp report like a tree falling, followed by the sustained thunder of the roof caving in. 15 people died in the collapse, or froze in the following hours, trapped in wreckage, unable to escape into the killing storm outside. Other longhouses followed. Some failed from snow load. Others failed when occupants, desperate for fuel, began burning structural components. Others simply couldn't maintain survivable temperature despite continuous fires. The heat loss through their timber and turf walls exceeded any fire's capacity to compensate. Kjartan heard the collapses, muffled by distance and snow. He knew what the sounds meant, but he couldn't help. Leaving his shelter in such conditions would mean death. He could only survive and hope others were doing the same. The storm continued through January into February, finally breaking in mid-February after nearly 2 months of continuous assault. The settlement had experienced the worst winter in recorded memory, conditions that exceeded anything the traditional longhouse design could handle. When the storm finally broke, Kjartan emerged from his shelter to assess the damage. The landscape was unrecognizable. Snow had drifted to heights of 15 feet in places, burying everything. The settlement's longhouses were invisible, just mounds of white, some with depressions where roofs had collapsed. He spent days digging, checking each structure, pulling bodies from the wreckage. 37 dead in 9 longhouses. Jarl Thorstein, his wife, his 3 sons, his household warriors, farmers, servants, children, livestock. Nearly half the settlement's population dead from cold, from crushing, from the failure of structures that everyone had trusted. His stone shelter stood untouched. The turf roof had accumulated additional snow, which had added insulation rather than threatening collapse. The corbelled stone dome beneath hadn't shifted at all. The weight actually pressed the stones more firmly into place. The walls showed no damage. The entrance tunnel had remained clear enough for ventilation with minimal daily maintenance. Chieftain was the only survivor in the immediate area. Others in outlying farms had survived, but the core settlement was devastated. When the rescue party arrived in April, they found him cooking fish over his peat fire, comfortable in his primitive cairn, while corpses lay frozen in the collapsed halls of men who'd called him a fool. The rescue party leader, a man named Snorri Karlsson from the neighboring fjord, demanded an explanation. "Your stone hut survived when every longhouse failed. How?" Chieftain walked them through everything: the thick double walls with insulation between, the partially underground floor that connected to stable earth temperature, the corbelled roof that couldn't collapse, the entrance tunnel that blocked wind, the thermal mass of the stone that stored heat and released it slowly. "The longhouses fight winter," Chieftain explained. "Big fires trying to push back cold. Thin walls losing heat as fast as it's generated. My shelter doesn't fight, it hides. Thick walls hold heat in. Underground floor borrows warmth from the earth. Stone absorbs fire warmth during the day and releases it through the night. I need 1/5 the fuel to stay twice as warm. But stone is cold. Everyone knows this. Stone feels cold when you touch it because it conducts heat away from your skin. But stone holds heat for a long time once you warm it. Those hearthstones," Chieftain pointed to the circular arrangement in his floor, "they weigh 500 pounds. Heated properly, they release warmth for 12 hours after the fire dies. The walls work the same way. The entire structure becomes a heat storage vessel." Snorri looked at the arrangement with new eyes. The flat stones arranged in circles, the thick walls, the domed roof. It wasn't primitive, it was engineered. "Why didn't you tell people? Why didn't you teach them?" Chieftain laughed without humor. "I tried. For 13 years I tried. Thorstein called me a savage Pict. The others called my shelter a cairn, a burial mound. They said I was building my own grave." He gestured at the collapsed longhouses. "Turns out they were building theirs." Snorri and his rescue party spent 3 days with Chieftain, learning the principles of his construction. The physics were straightforward once explained. Thermal mass. Dense materials like basalt have high heat capacity. They can absorb and store large amounts of thermal energy. Chieftain's 500 pounds of hearthstones, heated to 400 degrees, stored approximately 40,000 BTUs of energy. Released over 12 hours, this provided roughly 300 BTUs per hour, equivalent to a small continuous fire, but requiring no fuel or attention. Insulation. The double walls with turf filling provided resistance to heat transfer. Cold outside couldn't easily reach the warm interior. Heat inside couldn't easily escape. The turf roof, especially with accumulated snow, provided additional insulation equivalent to modern construction standards. Underground temperature stability. The partially excavated floor placed the living space in contact with earth that maintained a stable temperature of approximately 45 degrees year-round. Cold, but vastly warmer than the -40 air above. This stable temperature provided a baseline that the heating system only needed to improve by 25 degrees, not 65 degrees. Shape efficiency. The circular floor plan minimized surface area relative to interior volume. A circle encloses maximum area with minimum perimeter. Less surface area meant less heat loss. The domed roof eliminated corners where cold air could accumulate. Wind protection. The rounded shape and entrance tunnel prevented wind from pressuring the structure or forcing cold air inside. Longhouses with their rectangular shapes and door openings experienced significant heat loss from wind infiltration. Structural stability. The corbelled dome distributed load evenly and couldn't collapse under weight. Additional load only pressed the stones more firmly together. The thick walls could withstand any wind force. There were no timber elements that could rot, burn, or fail well under stress. Modern calculations confirm the efficiency difference. A typical Viking longhouse lost heat at approximately 50,000–80,000 BTUs per hour in extreme winter conditions, requiring massive continuous fires to maintain temperature. Jarl's stone shelter lost heat at approximately 5,000–8,000 BTUs per hour, an order of magnitude less. His small twice-daily fires were more than sufficient. The implications were stark. Jarl had achieved better comfort with less fuel, better survival with less risk, better durability with less maintenance. His primitive shelter was technologically superior to prestigious Norse construction in every measurable way. But for 13 years, no one had been willing to see it. Pride had blinded them to evidence right before their eyes. Word of Kjartan's survival spread through Iceland. The story had all the elements that captured Norse imagination: tragedy, irony, vindication. The fool had outlived the wise. The outcast had outlasted the Jarl. The primitive shelter had defeated the proud halls. Some dismissed it as luck. Others attributed it to dark magic. Perhaps Kjartan had made a bargain with spirits. But practical people recognized the truth. Kjartan had built better, and his building had saved him. Over the following years, stone shelters began appearing across Iceland, not as primary residences. Norse pride still demanded proper longhouses for that, but as backup structures, emergency refuges, places to survive when the main hall failed. These Kjartan houses saved lives in subsequent severe winters, sheltering families whose longhouses became uninhabitable. Some builders went further, incorporating Kjartan's principles into larger structures. They built longhouses with thicker walls, with stone-lined hearths designed for heat retention, with double-wall construction that improved insulation. They couldn't abandon tradition entirely, but they could learn from what had worked. Kjartan himself became something of a legend, the man who'd been mocked for 13 years. Then vindicated in a single winter. He never achieved the status he might have had with a proper longhouse, but he earned a different kind of respect, the acknowledgement that he'd been right when everyone else was wrong. He lived until 1142, dying at approximately 63 years old, an exceptional age for the era. He spent his final 24 years in the same stone shelter, expanding it slightly, improving its comfort, demonstrating year after year that it worked. His funeral was better attended than anyone would have predicted 13 years after his arrival. The new Jarl, who'd been a child during the Great Storm, spoke at the ceremony. Kjartan Ormsson built what we called a cairn, and we laughed at him. Then the storm came, and our halls collapsed, and our people froze, and Kjartan sat warm in his cairn while we died. He tried to warn us. We wouldn't listen. 37 people paid for our pride with their lives. Let no one forget what happens when we value appearance over survival. Modern archaeology has excavated numerous stone structures from medieval Iceland, some showing the exact techniques Kjartan used. Analysis confirms the physics. Heat retention testing, reconstructed stone shelters with central hearths show interior temperature maintenance of 12 to 14 hours after fires extinguish, compared to 2 to 3 hours for timber frame reconstructions. The thermal mass effect is measurable and significant. Fuel efficiency studies. Experimental archaeology demonstrates that well-insulated stone structures require 60–80% less fuel than timber longhouses to maintain equivalent temperatures. In resource-scarce environments like Iceland, this efficiency was potentially life-saving. Structural durability. Stone structures from the Viking Age remain standing today. Over 1,000 years later, no timber longhouse has survived intact. The material choice had profound implications for long-term survival. Climate adaptation. As the medieval warm period ended and the Little Ice Age began, Icelandic building practices shifted toward more stone, more insulation, more thermal mass. The survivors learned what Kjartan had known all along. Everyone mocked Kjartan Ormsson's stone shelter. They called it a cairn, a burial mound, a Pictish hovel unworthy of a free Norseman. They said stone was cold, primitive, shameful. They said that proper men built proper longhouses with proper timber frames and proper central hearths. Then the worst storm in 100 Years hit, and 37 people froze to death in their proper longhouses while Kjartan sat at 70 degrees in his stone shelter, warm enough to remove his tunic, drinking hot broth, sleeping comfortably through nights that killed everyone within 20 miles. The stone that everyone called cold became the stone that saved his life. The mass that everyone dismissed as primitive became the mass that stored heat through endless winter nights. The techniques everyone laughed at became the techniques that worked when nothing else did. Kjartan had learned from the Picts, from builders who'd thrived in harsh climates for thousands of years before the Norse arrived. He'd learned that survival wasn't about impressing neighbors. It was about understanding physics. Stone absorbs heat. Thick walls hold heat in. Underground floors borrow warmth from the earth. Small spaces require less heating. These truths didn't care about status or pride or tradition. 37 people died because they valued appearance over function. They built halls that announced their importance to the world, halls that consumed forests to heat, halls that collapsed when conditions exceeded their design parameters. Kjartan built a structure that announced nothing except survival. His shelter was invisible, forgettable, the kind of building that earned no respect and told no stories of wealth or power, but it kept him alive when every prestigious hall in the settlement became a tomb. Sometimes the primitive way is the only way that works. Sometimes the fool is the only one who survives. And sometimes the stone that feels cold to the touch is the warmest shelter when the world outside is trying to kill you. Kjartan Ormson's primitive stone shelter stayed at 70 degrees while 37 people froze to death in proper Norse construction. That's the only verdict that matters.